to the new Yankee workshop. Over the last few episodes, we've been building things for the kitchen. Today, we're going to build a chef's table. Just the right height for the chef to work comfortably at, and the right surface to work on. We'll have a place to hang the chef's towel, a nice big shelf down the bottom to store the stock pots, 2 good-sized drawers for all the indispensable cooking utensils, and we'll even put a slot in the top to store the knives. All of that and more next on the new Yankee workshop.
The new Yankee workshop features the craftsmanship of Norm Abram and is made possible by
Delta Woodworking Machinery. A full line of precision shop tools available at woodworking dealers, hardware stores, and home centers. Delta, building on tradition.
Porter Cable, building performance and innovation in the woodworking tools since 1906. Available through woodworking dealers, hardware stores, and home centers everywhere. Porter Cable, the woodworker's choice.
and by
Form Bees. With a complete line of furniture refinishing products to uncover wood's natural charm.
Now, it wouldn't be a proper chef's table without a maple butcher block top. I guess chefs like this for a work surface because it's easy on their knives. Now, I could have made up the top myself, but at these prices, it's cheaper to go to my local counter supplier and just buy a blank. They have all different sizes. You just tell them what you want. The base of the table is going to be painted, so the choice of material here is poplar. Poplar is a stable material, and it holds paint very well. Now, if you'd like to build the chef's table, a measure drawing is available with the materials list, and you'll hear more about that before the program ends. Now, I want to get started today taking these nice, thick 16-quarter pieces and making some blanks for my tapered legs. Now, because the material is so thick, and the saw only comes up to about 2 3/4 inches, I'm going to have to run the pieces through twice to get all the way through. But before we use any power tools, let's take a moment to talk about shop safety. Be sure to read, follow, and understand all the safety rules that come with your power tools. Knowing how to use your power tools properly will greatly reduce the risk of personal injury. And remember this, there is no more important safety rule than to wear these safety glasses. Whenever I work with rough sawn stock, I find that the pieces are often uneven and even twisted, and this is part of the sawing and the drying process. So to get a nice square blank, the first thing to do is to surface one edge on my joiner. With one surface nice and flat on all 4 pieces, I'm ready to go to the next step, which is to take this surface, put it up against the fence of the joiner, and joint this side, giving me a perfectly square corner. With 2 adjoining surfaces flat and perfectly square to one another, I can now place those surfaces against my rip fence and rip a blank that's a little bit bigger than what I need in the end, and I know that it'll be perfectly square. Okay, now the final machining step to the blanks is to make the 2 freshly sawn surfaces smooth. Now, because the cutter head in my surface planer is above the table, I want to make sure I keep the jointed surface on the table. These are pretty massive legs, so to lighten the look of the piece, I'm going to taper them. Both inside corners will be tapered. Now, I start by coming down from the top of the leg 9 inches. I need a square section for where the rails and the drawer parts are going to come in. Then I go to the bottom of the leg and measure over 2 inches, which is what I want to remain, and just connect those 2 points. Now, to taper the leg, I'm going to use my homemade tapering jig, just a couple pieces of plywood with a hinge on one end and an adjustment feature on the other end, which gives me a pretty good variety of tapers. Now, to set up the taper, I'm going to put the jig against my rip fence and slide the blank so that it's right up against the stop. And then I'm going to take a rough measurement up here at the top edge of the taper. And that's about 5 6/5 strong. So then I come down here and swing the adjustment edge out to the same measurement, loosely lock it in place, double check it, could be just a little bit more, and lock the whole assembly down. Now I slide the jig and the blank over to my saw blade and pull it back to where the taper is going to start, right to the leading edge of the saw blade. And I want to stay away from it about a 30-second. That'll give me some extra material to clean up at the joiner later. Lock it in. And as you can see, as I push this forward, I'll take off an increasingly wider wedge until I get to the bottom. Okay, now I'm going to take the whole assembly back, reset it against the rip fence, turn the leg a quarter turn, make sure it's up against the stop, and do the adjacent edge. Now I'll just clean up the tapered edge at my joiner. Now I'm beginning to form mortises in the tapered legs using my hollow chisel mortiser. I've set it up with a 1/2-inch chisel through which there is a 1/2-inch bit. Now the bit takes out most of the material and the chisel squares it up. There are several mortises needed. There are 2 at the bottom of the leg, 1 on each side, and they will receive the stretchers which will support the bottom shelf. Then up here at the top, there'll be another 1/2-inch wide mortise, which is going to be for the support rail of the drawers. And then around on the other side, I'm going to change to a 3/8-inch chisel and make this long mortise, which will receive the short rails. Now here I'm beginning to form the mortises for the draw support rail. I'm still using the 1/2-inch chisel. I simply move the fence back a 1/4 inch and readjust the depth so that I go 1 inch into the leg. Although there's only one thing that this machine does, it does it very well. But there are different sized chisels. We've been using the 1/2-inch. We're now going to set up with the 3/8-inch. Now we're ready to make some mortises. Now I like to make my first plunge right at the bottom of my mortise line and then take about 3/4 the width of the chisel with each pass. Now if you start to get a lot of burning, it's time to send the chisel and bit out and get it sharpened. Now there are different rails going into these mortises. The support rail is square to the top, therefore it'll just have a 90-degree shoulder cut. But down here at the bottom, the stretchers, which are going to support the bottom shelf, have to be cut at an angle to match the taper of the legs. Now that angle is about 2.5 degrees, so I've set my miter box at 2.5 degrees, laid out the length of the stretchers, and now I can trim the ends. The first step in forming the tenon is to make a shoulder cut. And because the ends are cut at an angle, I simply turn my miter gauge until the piece is flush against the fence. That'll allow me to make one cut. To make the other cut, I'll have to turn the miter gauge to the other side and run all the pieces through for a 1-inch long tenon. Now I've readjusted my miter gauge to 90 degrees to make the shoulder cuts on the upper rails. To complete the tenon, I'm using my tenoning jig. It has this clamp which holds the piece securely in a vertical position. There are adjustment features to this fence which allow me to move it in and out until I get the tenon just the right thickness. Now the most important thing is to keep this edge, particularly when we have a bevel cut like the one on these stretchers, tight to the table. The rails for the short end of the table fit into those 3/8-inch mortises that I made earlier. Just a piece of 3/4-inch stock. Now to form the tenon, I'm using my stacked dado head cutter with a sacrificial strip. I'll make a pass on each side, which will form part of the tenon. Then I'll move the fence to get the 1-inch length that I need and run it through again. Now here, with the dado head raised to a 1/2 inch, I've just made a couple passes to nibble away the top edge of the tenon so that it's concealed in the leg. Here I've taken all the parts that I've manufactured so far and dry fitted them together, making sure that all the joints are nice and tight and that my measurements are correct. And I've also cut 2 pieces of 3/4 inch thick stock, which are going to go right even with the tops of the legs, right like this, and they'll get joined with biscuits later. What I've done is just laid out for 3 posts that are going to support the runners for the drawers. I want to make mortises in the rail and mortises in this top piece for those posts. Here I'm beginning to form tenons on the ends of the short blocks that go between those rails using the same procedures I showed you earlier. The method of connection between the post or the leg and this top rail is simply a biscuit. That should be plenty to hold it together. I have to break this down before I glue it up, but I want to show you one more milling detail that I'm going to make. The corners of the legs are very sharp. They're going to get dinged and nicked very easily. So I think what I'm going to do is this double bead detail right down the outside corner, all the way from the top right down to the bottom. And I think that'll prevent some of the damage. I'm also going to do a single bead detail along the bottom of this rail and also along the bottom of the end rail. Here I've just taken one of those small vertical posts and made a dado through it. And you'll notice that I've attached a piece of plywood to my miter gauge because I'm working with such a short piece. Now these dados are going to receive hardwood runners which will support the drawers. There are a lot of these parts that are easier to be sanded now than before the piece is assembled. Tomorrow is soon enough for the glue-up. Well, good morning. Mission accomplished. Last night, I completed all the sanding of the pieces that we've made so far, and now I'm starting the glue-up. The first section to put together are the long rails and these divider posts, which actually are going to support our drawers. I simply put glue in the mortises and on the tenons, and with that done, I'll clamp this sub-assembly together and then attach it to the legs. Okay, now with glue in the mortise of the leg and the slot for the biscuit, slip in one of these number 10 biscuits and then bring the whole assembly together. Okay, now this leg, I'm only going to slip part way onto the tenon because I have to install the stretcher at the bottom first. With the glue on the stretcher, let's see if we can't fit that in, and then we'll clamp the whole thing up. And now a big clamp across the top of the legs, and I'll put another one at the bottom. It's good. All right, that takes care of one. Now let's build the other long side. All right, that's good. That takes care of the second one. Now I'm just going to lay this on the bench and build up the short ends from here. Well, I'm not crazy about putting this much glue on a big, wide rail like this because the grain on the rail is going this way, the grain on the leg is going that way. A classic cross-grain situation. But I can't think of any other way to handle it. I think I'll just use the floor as a workbench to slip this other large assembly onto the short stretchers and these big side rails. Well, here's a chapter from our past. I brought out one of the first projects ever built here at the New Yankee Workshop 11 years ago. It's a medicine cabinet. It's actually upside down, and I brought it out because I wanted to show you a joint. The sides of the cabinet are assembled with a box joint, and you can see how beautiful it is, especially when you have a natural finish on the piece. Now here's a box joint that hasn't been glued up, and this will give you an idea of how it works. Just fingers that intersect. There's a lot of glue surface area, and once the glue dries, that's a very strong joint. And I thought this would be a good choice for the drawers of our chef's table. Now I found the jig, believe it or not, even though we haven't used it for 11 years, and I want to show you how it's made. It couldn't be simpler. It's just a piece of oak attached to my miter gauge. Now on this side there's a couple notches which you can disregard. They're for another application. Let me tell you how I made the jig. The first thing I did was set up my stacked dado for the width of the box joint, 3/8 in this case. Then I ran the piece through, making one pass. Then I carefully measured over 3/8 of an inch and made a second pass, and then made this little oak pin which is just attached with a screw. Now the way the jig works is that I'll take the draw front first and I'll align it with this pencil mark and make the first pass. Okay, now I'm going to take one of the draw sides, slide it up against the pin, and make the first full notch. Now I'll take the first piece that I made, slide it up against the pin, take the second piece, drop it over the pin, and just keep making successive notches in this corner all the way across the board. Okay, let's see how that goes together. That's good. The next thing to do is to make a groove in the side pieces to receive the 1/4-inch plywood bottom. Now, I don't want that groove to go all the way through because it'll ruin my box joints. So I've set up a 1/4-inch bit at my router table, and I've transferred a couple lines back, a 1/4-inch behind the bit, a 1/4-inch in front of the bit. What I want to do is plunge the piece down right at the front line, run it through, and remove it when I get to the back line. Now for the assembly, I just put a nice thin coat of glue in between all these fingers. You don't need too much. And then just slip the pieces together, like so. Okay, now just stand it up and slip in the plywood bottom. Then I'll be able to glue up the remaining fingers and attach the other side. Guess that does it for the glue. Let's put this end on. Okay, now I can clamp it up. Now I'm ready to start working on the bottom shelf. It's going to be made up of some 7/16-inch thick boards, just butt jointed together, no tongue and groove. Now I don't want it to look like a monolithic piece. I want it to look like individual boards. So to accentuate that, I'm just going to knock the corners off of these boards, just a slight bevel. And the easiest way to do that is to use my joiner, which I've tipped the fence to 45 degrees. I'll run one edge through, then the other. Now I'm going to start putting the boards on the base at each end of the table and work my way to the middle. The end boards need to be notched out to fit around this leg. And the best way to make the cut is over at the bandsaw. Okay, now I just slide the piece in around the legs and nail it into the stretchers with some 1-inch brads. Oh boy. Now I have one of the worst situations I could run into, a little narrow strip left over in the middle. Now the only way I can really fix this is to shorten a few of these boards in the center. So if I lap them over one another about 1 inch and remove that much material, you see that I very quickly gain enough space in the middle to fit the final board. It would pretty much be the same way you would lay out decking on a porch. Now can you tell where the narrow boards are? Not really, not unless you use a tape measure. And a little block plane action to soften the end grain. Now the draws are going to ride on these hardwood runners that fit into the slots I made in these little post pieces. And I've cut them a bit longer and just beveled the edge. I want them proud of the surface. Now I'm going to attach them to the post with a screw. And I need to pre-drill and countersink a hole. And the best way to do that is at the drill press. Well, now we're back to the draws. The glue has dried, so I've removed them from the clamps. And wait till you see how beautiful these joints look once I start to sand them up. All right, look at that. Now, even though we're going to paint these draws, you'll still see a trace of the joint that'll show through the paint. Okay, what I've done here is made a groove in each side of my drawer, and that's going to allow me to slide it onto the hardwood runners. Let's see if it's going to fit. Not bad, a little bit of wax, and that'll take care of the tightness. Now the table needs a towel bar for the chef to put his towel on, so these will be the brackets that'll hold the rod. Now you might have noticed that I left the line over at the bandsaw, and that's so I could sand it smooth to the line at my oscillating spindle sander. Now I just round over the edges using a 1/4-inch round-over bit. Now I want to drill a hole for the rod, but I don't want it to go all the way through. Now the brackets are going to go right up against the leg on this short side of the table, and I'll drive some screws from the back side to attach them. Now I'm just going to take a piece of 3/4-inch oak, slip it into one hole, then into the hole of the opposite bracket, and attach that one with some screws. All right, well, we'll put one more of these on down the other end, then we'll be ready for a coat of primer. The primer that I'm using on our piece is a high-quality oil-based primer, and I want to cover every surface, inside and out. For the color coat on our chef's table, I'm turning to a paint that I used on an earlier project. It's a nice, bright yellow, so it's going to look great in the kitchen. Now, one of the things that I like about this paint is that it's a solvent-based paint. It goes on easily, and it's self-leveling, so the brush marks will go away as it dries. Now, I'm not worried about putting paint in the groove of this draw side because I've made it larger than the runner, so it won't bind up when all the paint is applied. Now, this paint, when it's dry, gives me a real high gloss finish, and it's real easy to clean up. While the paint dries, I want to take care of a few more details on the butcher block top. I want to provide a place to store the chef's knives. So I've laid out a center line, and I'm going to cut 3 6-inch slots, leaving some wood between to keep strength in the top. Now I'm going to clamp this straight edge on. I've made some marks from the center line to the edge of the straight edge, which is the same distance as from the edge of my router to the center of this 1/4-inch bit, which I'll use to cut the slot. Now it's going to take a few passes to get all the way through this 1.5-inch butcher block. Well, I think I'll try a couple of the knives. That's going to work well. Now I'm going to go back to my belt sander and knock off these corners. And the key here is to keep the sander flat to the edge. Now there's one more routing operation here, and that's to round over the edges, both at the top and the bottom. And I'm simply using a 1/4-inch radius round over bit. Yeah, one more thing. Friend of the show made us a branding iron, which is actually our logo. So now every time I build a piece, I want to mark it. Well, there you have it, one chef's table. Now I'm putting a little bit of oil on this butcher block top. I'm using mineral oil because it's non-toxic and it won't go rancid. Now this was a really nice project. That just about takes care of all the woodworking and finish. Now maybe 2 or 3 years of cooking lessons from my friend Julia Child, and I'll feel qualified to use this table. Let me show you what we're going to build next time.